There is a painting most people recognize before they know why they recognize it. A man fills the frame, 2 feet planted wide apart, 2 fists resting on 2 hips, a chest broad enough to block a doorway, eyes that do not ask permission. The face does not smile. The face does not need to. This is Henry VIII of England, as painted by Hans Holbein the Younger in 1537, or rather, this is the version of Henry VIII that Henry VIII decided the world would see. There is a difference, and that difference is the whole story. The original mural was painted on the wall of Whitehall Palace. It burned in a fire in 1698. What survived were copies, preparatory drawings, versions painted by other hands in other years, each one filtered through someone else's memory of what the original looked like. The most recognized face in English royal history exists today only as a reproduction of a reproduction. Nobody alive has ever seen the real thing. Henry would have found that intolerable. He spent 43 years on the throne of England doing one thing above everything else. He bent reality to match the image he had constructed of himself. He rewrote marriages into annulments. He rewrote a church into an instrument of royal will. He rewrote living women into legal problems to be solved. He rewrote advisers who knew too much into traitors who deserved to die. He rewrote his own children into legitimate or illegitimate, depending on what the moment required. When he stood in front of Holbein and decided how he wanted to look, he was doing what he always did, deciding the version of events that everyone else was going to have to live inside. There is one question worth asking, the one this story is about. What happens when a man with that much power runs into the one thing he cannot rewrite? The answer cost England more than anyone who paid it ever agreed to pay. Here is where it started. Picture a boy sitting in a palace schoolroom in the winter of 1502. He is 10 years old. A tutor is speaking somewhere in the room. The boy is not listening. A messenger arrived that morning from Ludlow Castle, 4 days' ride to the northwest, and the message changed everything about who this boy was and what his life was going to be. His brother Arthur is dead. The boy's name is Henry. That fact, that Henry Tudor was not supposed to be king, sits underneath everything else in this story, the way a fault line sits underneath a city. Most of the time you cannot see it, but it explains every tremor. The throne of England belonged to Arthur. Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, firstborn son of Henry VII, named after the legendary king who was supposed to return and make Britain great again. Arthur was prepared for kingship from the moment he could walk. At 15, he was married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess whose mother was Isabella of Castile, arguably the most powerful woman in the world at that time. The wedding was a statement to all of Europe. The Tudor dynasty had arrived, and it was here to stay. Arthur died 4 months after the wedding. He was 16 years old. The cause was most likely sweating sickness, a disease that moved fast enough to leave almost no time to prepare. He was there, and then he was not. And with him went the entire, carefully constructed future of the Tudor court. Henry became the heir. What happened next shaped the man Henry VIII became before he ever sat on a throne. And it deserves more attention than it typically gets. Henry VII had fought and bled and schemed to build a dynasty that had no ancient right to exist. The Tudors were not old royalty. Henry VII had won the crown at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, ending the Wars of the Roses. And the memory of that war lived in the bones of the Tudor court. The memory of what happened when royal succession became a question rather than a certainty. Families torn apart, A country destabilized repeatedly. Thousands dead over who had the right to rule. Henry VII had already buried one son. He was not going to risk the other. So he kept the boy close. He kept him watched. He kept him protected with an intensity that must have felt, to a young prince, with the energy and intelligence of Henry, almost suffocating. No free jousting. No campaign. No physical risk. The young Henry was the last asset of a dynasty that had already lost too much. And his father treated him exactly like that. An asset, something to be preserved. Think about what that does to a boy who is brilliant and physical, and burning with energy, and told every day, by the walls closing around him, that he is too valuable to be allowed to live freely. Henry VII died in April of 1509. Henry was 17 years old. One of the first public acts of the new reign was to have two men arrested and executed. Their names were Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley. They had been the old king's most effective tax collectors. The men, responsible for filling the royal treasury through enforcement methods the English nobility had despised for years. They were efficient. They were hated by almost everyone except the king they served. Henry had them tried for treason on charges that were, legally speaking, thin. They were convicted and beheaded on Tower Hill. The crowds cheered. Henry VIII was 17 years old and had already understood something that takes most people a lifetime to learn. If you want people to love you, give them someone to hate on your behalf. He spent his father's most unpopular servants like coins and bought the goodwill of a kingdom that had been waiting years to cheer for something. But here is what nobody in that cheering crowd stopped to notice. He had just used the machinery of the law to produce the outcome he wanted. He had taken an existing system, pointed it at a target, and generated a result that was technically legal and entirely convenient. The law was flexible enough, with the right pressure applied in the right places, to produce whatever verdict was required. He was 17. He would spend the next 4 decades refining that understanding until it became something England had never seen before and has never quite seen since. But in 1509, standing at the beginning of a reign that stretched out in front of him like an open road, none of what was coming was visible yet. What was visible was a young man who was everything his cold, calculating father had not been. Tall, handsome, generous, ready to spend money on pageants and tournaments and music and all the things that made a court feel alive rather than like an accounting office. England exhaled. It had been holding its breath for a long time. June of 1520. A field outside the English town of Guines, near Cleves. 2 kings rode toward each other across ground that had been transformed, over weeks of preparation, into something the people who witnessed it would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe. Tents and pavilions decorated with enough gold cloth that the light on a clear day was almost blinding. Fountains running with wine. Tournaments. Banquets. Performances. And ceremonies so elaborate that planning them had taken the better part of a year. The location became known, permanently, as the Field of the Cloth of Gold, Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France. Both young, both ambitious, both convinced that the future of the continent ran through them. Henry loved every second of it. Set aside everything that comes later. Set aside the executions, the wait, the body that would eventually require a mechanical chair to move between rooms. Set it all aside and look at the man who rode onto that field in 1520. He was 28 years old. 6 feet 2 inches tall at a time when the average Englishman stood around 5 feet 7. He moved on a horse the way men with his build and training move when they have been doing it since childhood. With the easy authority of someone who has never doubted the horse would do what he asked. He competed in tournaments and had the record to prove he was genuinely good at it, though his courtiers had developed a careful habit of not competing too hard against the king, Erasmus of Rotterdam. The closest thing the early 16th century had to a universally respected intellectual had met Henry years earlier, when Henry was still a boy, and had written about him with a warmth that Erasmus did not give away carelessly. He saw in the young prince the outline of a truly great king, a man of sharp intelligence, combined with an unusual willingness to engage seriously with ideas. Henry spoke Latin and French fluently. He composed music seriously enough that real musicians complimented him without flattery. He had written a theological treatise defending the Catholic Church against Martin Luther, and it was strong enough that Pope Leo X awarded him the title Fide Defensor, Defender of the Faith. In 1521, the title was meant as a papal compliment. History would eventually make it one of the great ironies of the entire century. But in 1520, standing in that field of gold, none of the irony was visible yet. What was visible was a king who seemed assembled specifically to disprove the idea that power corrupts. Physically magnificent, intellectually serious, politically active, and apparently happy, Catherine of Aragon was at his side, and she deserves a full accounting here. She was 34 in 1520, 5 years older than Henry, the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. She had grown up watching two of the most formidably competent rulers in European history operate at the highest level, and she had been educated accordingly. Her Latin was excellent. Her understanding of diplomacy came from living inside it, not reading about it. She had also survived something that would have broken most people. After Arthur died in 1502, Catherine spent 7 years in England in a state of extraordinary uncertainty, a foreign widow in a country negotiating her future with her father, her dowry with Henry VII, and her dignity with nobody. She went through periods of genuine poverty. She maintained through all of it a composure and a dignity that even people actively trying to use her as a bargaining chip found difficult to attack. When Henry VIII chose to marry her in 1509, he was not rescuing a helpless woman. He was choosing a partner who had demonstrated, under real pressure, exactly the kind of spine that Tudor monarchy was going to require. For the first decade of their marriage, things were genuinely good between them. He called her, in letters, his entirely beloved wife. There was one problem. At the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, Catherine and Henry had been married for 11 years. In those 11 years she had been pregnant at least 6 times. One daughter, Mary, had survived. The rest had not. One son lived for 52 days. Another was stillborn. Another lived only briefly. The empty cradle, the missing son, the fear that had not yet become an obsession but was already on its way. Quiet and persistent, growing underneath everything like water, finding the fault line. In 1520, standing in a field that glittered with gold, Henry VIII was the most admired king in Europe. He had everything except the one thing he had decided he could not live without. Greenwich Palace, 1525. Henry VIII is standing in a great hall, surrounded by the most powerful men in England, and he is about to do something that will tell everyone in that room exactly how frightened he has become. A boy is being brought forward. He is 6 years old. His name is Henry Fitzroy. He is the king's son by a former mistress, a young woman named Elizabeth Blount, whose connection to Henry ended quietly years ago with the kind of efficiency that royal households applied to these situations. The boy is healthy. The boy is male. And today, in front of witnesses, in front of the court, in front of the ambassadors of foreign powers who will write home about what they have seen, Henry VIII is going to make him Duke of Richmond and Somerset and give him a household and an income and a place in the line of succession that no illegitimate child has occupied in English history within living memory. Catherine of Aragon is present. She says nothing. Her face gives nothing away. But the message her husband has just sent her is not subtle. And she is not a woman who misses messages. The court understands it too. Every man standing in that room is doing the same calculation. If Henry is willing to consider placing a bastard on the throne, then the Queen's situation is more precarious than anyone had said out loud. The marriage is not just strained. It is, in the minds of the men who run England, beginning to look like a problem that needs a solution. To understand why Henry did this, and why it mattered so much, you have to understand the particular kind of fear that had been building in him for years. It was not the fear of a man being irrational. It was the fear of a man who had studied history closely enough to know exactly what he was afraid of. The Wars of the Roses had ended less than 40 years before this moment. In the lifetime of men and women still alive in 1525, England had watched noble families tear each other apart over who had the legitimate right to the throne. The whole brutal cycle had only ended because Henry VII managed to unite competing claims through his own victory and his marriage to Elizabeth of York. That settlement was still fragile, not because anyone was actively plotting against it, but because the memory of what fragility looked like was still fresh enough that people who had lived through it checked the horizon every morning. A queen regnant, a woman ruling in her own right, had never been done successfully in England. The one time something close to it had been attempted. In the 12th century, it had produced a civil war that lasted 19 years. Henry knew this history. Every advisor around him knew it. Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Isabella of Castile, almost certainly knew it better than any of them. Henry's need for a son was not simply vanity or selfishness. It was rooted in a genuine fear about what happened to kingdoms that left succession unresolved. He was not wrong to worry. He was wrong about almost everything he did in response to that worry. But the worry itself was rational. That is the foundation everything else is built on. Somewhere behind all the political calculation, a woman was being told, by the ceremony she was watching in silence, that 18 years of her life might not have been enough. Into this climate of growing dread came Thomas Wolsey. Picture him at the peak of his power, a large man, physically imposing, moving through the corridors of influence with the practiced ease of someone who has been the most important person in every room for so long that importance has become his natural posture. He was the son of a prosperous butcher from Ipswich, in the rigid hierarchies of Tudor England. That background should have placed a ceiling above him that no amount of talent could break through. It did not, because Wolsey's talent was of a kind that ceilings cannot contain. He rose through the church because the church was one of the few institutions that could elevate a man on ability rather than birth. By 1515 he was Lord Chancellor of England and a cardinal of the Catholic Church, the two most powerful positions in the kingdom after the king himself. He handled the paperwork of empire, the negotiations, the administrative machinery that kept a kingdom running while its king was busy being magnificent. Henry used him the way you use a tool that does exactly what you need it to do. You do not think about how the tool feels about being used. You care that the result appears when you need it. But here is what Wolsey could not fix, and what made everything after this moment inevitable. By 1525, the cradle was still empty of the right kind of child. Every adviser in England understood this, and Henry, standing in that great hall watching his illegitimate son receive a duke's title while his legitimate wife watched in silence, had just shown the entire court how far he was willing to go to solve the problem. That willingness was about to find its target, somewhere in the halls and antechambers where the social mathematics of Tudor England were constantly being recalculated. A young woman had recently returned from several years in France. She had been educated in the French court and had absorbed something of its directness, its willingness to treat ideas as worth fighting over, its particular understanding of how intelligent women moved through powerful rooms. Her name was Anne Boleyn. Her sister Mary had been Henry's mistress for a period in the early 1520s and had been set aside with the quiet efficiency that Henry applied to complications he had finished with. Anne had watched all of it. She was not going to make her sister's mistake. She was not going to be discarded. She had a different destination in mind, and she was already calculating the road to it with the precision of someone who understood that one wrong step in either direction meant the end of everything. Start with the letters, 17 of them, written by Henry VIII to Anne Boleyn between roughly 1526 and 1528. They were never supposed to leave England. Somehow they ended up in Rome, and today they sit in the Vatican Library, which is perhaps the single greatest geographical irony in the history of European diplomacy. The man who would break with Rome to have Anne Boleyn left the most intimate record of that desire in the one building in the world most associated with his enemy. The letters are not what you expect from a king. They are not commanding. They are not composed. They are the letters of a man who is completely off balance and cannot stop writing anyway. He calls himself Anne's servant. He says he cannot sleep. He begs for a response. He says that a year feels like 1,000 years when she is absent. In one letter he encloses a small jewel with a note saying that the owner of the jewel is the heart inside it, meaning himself. Meaning he is handing her his heart as an object she can choose to keep or return. A king, writing that to a woman who had not yet agreed to anything. The obvious question is why Henry was drawn to her. That part is not mysterious. She was striking and sharp and different in ways that the English court of the 1520s had not produced before. She had spent years in France, and it showed, not in affectation but in a kind of ease, with ideas and argument that English noblewomen of her generation rarely displayed in public. The more important question is what Anne wanted. She had watched her sister be used and quietly set aside. She had watched the court produce a series of women who occupied the king's attention for a season, and then disappeared from the official record into obscurity or arranged marriages. She understood the system from the inside. She had grown up watching it operate. Anne wanted the crown. She was not scheming in the simple theatrical sense that later portraits of her tend to suggest. She was doing something more precise. She understood something that very few people in that court had the clarity to see. Henry was a man whose desire had no natural ceiling. When he wanted something, he reorganized the world around getting it. She had watched him do it with policy, with money, with people. The question she appears to have asked herself was whether a woman could make herself the thing he reorganized the world to get. She held him off for years. This is not a small detail. It is the structural fact that made everything else possible. Because Henry who had never been denied anything he wanted with sufficient persistence. Encountered in Anne a resistance he could not simply wait out, or buy, or redirect. She was not rejecting him. She was making herself into something that required a different kind of response. She set the price at a wedding ring, at a crown, at a legitimate child who would be heir to England. She did not know yet that the same hunger which raised her would one day require her death. Henry agreed to her terms. And in agreeing, he stepped onto a road with no reversible section anywhere on it. Anne introduced Henry to the work of William Tyndale, whose English translation of the New Testament was still a banned book. She brought reformist ideas into conversations with a king who had literally written a defense of the Pope less than a decade earlier. She pushed at the walls of the world Henry inhabited and found that some of those walls were less solid than they looked. Henry was not a passive recipient of her influence. He had his own reasons for finding the reformist arguments interesting once he stopped being invested in defending the other side. But the direction of the push, the particular angle at which the walls were tested, has Anne Boleyn's fingerprints on it, the wider Anglican tradition that grew out of England's break with Rome, a tradition stretching across tens of millions of people on every inhabited continent today, was shaped in part by a woman whose name that tradition spent centuries trying to minimize or erase. Thomas Wolsey understood what was happening before most people did, and it frightened him in the specific way things frighten a man whose entire life rests on his ability to solve the king's problems. He could not solve this one. He could not persuade Rome. He could not produce an annulment from Catherine in a time frame that satisfied Henry. He tried every instrument available to him and found that every instrument had a limit. The letters from Henry became progressively less patient. The warmth that had characterized their working relationship drained away the way water drains from a container with a hole in the bottom. Slowly, then all at once, in 1529, Wolsey was stripped of the Lord Chancellorship. He retreated to his diocese in York, which compared to the Tower was mercy, but which for a man who had been at the centre of English power for 15 years was a kind of living death. He died the following year on his way back to London. Summoned to face treason charges, he did not survive long enough to answer. Later, accounts remembered his final hours as filled with regret. Those who were present recorded that he said, in words passed along and debated for generations, that if he had served God with the same dedication he had given the king, he would not have been left to die, abandoned in his old age. He was the first. He was not the last. And the man who came next was a different kind of instrument entirely, built for a different kind of work, in a world that was about to need things done that had never been done before. When Wolsey fell, Henry did not stop needing servants. He simply needed a different kind. A man who understood paper, law, property, silence, and the machinery of a state that was about to be rebuilt from the foundations up. That man was already in the room. He had been watching everything. He had been taking notes. His name was Thomas Cromwell, and he had not come this far to stop now. Hampton Court Palace, the spring of 1527. Catherine of Aragon is sitting in her private chambers when Henry comes to see her. He has prepared what he is going to say. He has thought carefully about how to frame it. He has the confidence of a man who has spent weeks convincing himself that he is delivering a theological conclusion rather than an ultimatum. He tells her their marriage has never been valid. She looks at her husband of 18 years and tells him he is wrong, not diplomatically, not with the careful softness of a woman managing a powerful man's feelings. She tells him plainly, without any visible anxiety about what the telling might cost her, that their marriage is valid, that she is his lawful wife, and that she will not pretend otherwise, regardless of what anyone, including the King of England, requires her to say. Henry did not expect that. He had expected grief. Perhaps negotiation, the kind of dignified but ultimately yielding response that a woman in her position, isolated in a foreign country, dependent on royal goodwill for access to her own daughter, might produce when confronted by a king who had made up his mind. He did not get that. Somewhere behind all the arguments that were about to follow, there was still a woman being told that 18 years of her life had been a mistake. She had decided it had not been, and she was prepared to spend what remained of her life making that point. What followed was 6 years of the most tangled legal and theological argument in the history of the English Church. It was called, with the dry understatement that English legal tradition specializes in, the great matter. Henry's case rested on a passage in the book of Leviticus stating that a man who marries his brother's widow commits an offense that will result in the couple being childless. The argument was straightforward. He had married his brother's widow. The scripture said this would produce childlessness. The lack of a surviving male heir was the proof. The marriage had been invalid from the beginning and should be annulled. Catherine's counter was equally direct. Her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. She was Arthur's widow in name only, the product of a political arrangement between a 15-year-old boy and a 16-year-old girl that lasted 4 months before the boy died. Her first real marriage was to Henry. That marriage was valid, sanctioned by a papal dispensation obtained specifically to address her status as Arthur's widow, and no king had the authority to declare it otherwise because it had become inconvenient. On the question of whether that first marriage had been consummated, only 2 people ever knew. One of them was Catherine, the other was dead. Anyone who presents this question as settled is working from preference rather than evidence. What the evidence does settle is this: the person who refused to bend was Catherine. Her refusal was not wounded pride. It was a reasoned position, held on principle, and she would not abandon it, regardless of the personal cost. The personal cost was considerable. She was separated from her daughter Mary. She was moved from palace to palace in conditions that declined from royal comfort toward something closer to supervised isolation. Her servants were reduced. Her title was stripped officially, though she continued to use it in every letter she wrote until the day she died. She was offered the possibility of retiring to a convent, which would have resolved the situation quietly. She refused. The law had its arguments, the court had its calculations, and Catherine had her answer, which was the same answer every time anyone asked the question, and she gave it without flinching every single time. She was the only person in Henry VIII's entire adult life who held a position against him consistently, publicly, and to the end. On the other side of the case sat Pope Clement VII, a man in an impossible position. Catherine of Aragon was the niece of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in Europe. Charles had troops, and those troops had sacked Rome in 1527 in one of the most destructive events of the century, leaving thousands dead and the Pope himself briefly imprisoned. Clement was still living in that shadow when Henry's request arrived on his desk. He could not grant the annulment without humiliating the emperor. He could not refuse without alienating the King of England. So he did what men in impossible positions often do. He delayed. He created committees. He moved the case to Rome. He generated procedural obstacles with the creativity of a man who understood that as long as the case was still in process, he had not technically said no. Henry waited. Henry pushed. Henry gathered legal opinions from universities across Europe, commissioning theological arguments, the way a modern lawyer commissions expert witnesses, paying for the conclusions he wanted and presenting them as independent scholarship. The scholars who agreed with him found themselves elevated. The scholars who disagreed found themselves considerably less comfortable. The process ground on, and while it ground on, Anne Boleyn waited. She had been waiting since roughly 1526, still waiting in 1527, 1528, 1529, 1530. 1531. Every year that passed was a year in which the promise Henry had made her remained unfulfilled. A year in which her position at court was powerful but precarious, dependent entirely on the continued intensity of a king's attention and on the forward motion of a legal case that kept finding new reasons to stall. The law had spoken, over and over, in every direction, at once. But everyone knew whose voice it was actually using. Then came Thomas Cromwell. He had entered royal service after Wolsey's fall and had made himself useful in the specific way that men of his particular intelligence make themselves useful. He saw what needed to be done and did it without waiting to be told twice. He understood law, property, administration, and political possibility in ways that the lawyers and theologians arguing about Leviticus did not. He also understood something that all of them had missed. Henry was trying to win an argument within a system that had the Pope at its head. He was trying to get the Pope to agree that the Pope's own predecessor had made a mistake. A system does not voluntarily generate verdicts that delegitimize its own authority. Cromwell's solution was not to win the argument. It was to change the system entirely. If Parliament declared that the King of England was the supreme head of the Church in England, then the Pope's opinion about Henry's marriage became legally irrelevant. Not wrong. Not overruled. Simply not applicable. The way a ruling from one country's court carries no weight in another country's courtroom. Different jurisdiction, different authority. End of case. Henry had been circling this idea for some time. The logic had a terrible elegance that appealed to a man who had spent 6 years trying to work within a framework that kept producing the wrong answer. Change the framework. Change who gets to provide the answer. He took Cromwell's solution. Catherine of Aragon understood before most people around her what this actually meant. It did not mean Henry was becoming Protestant. It meant Henry was becoming something that had not existed before in Western Christianity. A king who exercised supreme authority over both the temporal and spiritual life of his kingdom. A king for whom disobedience to royal policy and disobedience to God's order were becoming, by legal definition, the same thing. She wrote to her nephew Charles and to the Pope with increasing urgency. She was right about what was coming. She was wrong that it could be stopped. Chelsea, London. Sometime in the late 1520s, Henry VIII shows up unannounced at Thomas More's house on the river. He does this occasionally, walking in from the water with a small group of attendants. The kind of informal visit that kings make only to people they genuinely like and that More's neighbours, watching from a distance, have learned to recognize as a mark of unusual royal favour. Henry puts his arm around More's shoulder in the garden, and they walk and talk. Two men who have been having the same argument for years and enjoy having it, neither one willing to concede the point that would end it. More's daughter Margaret watches from a window. She has seen this before. She knows what it means that her father is one of the only people in England who can say things to the king that the king does not want to hear, and have the king come back for more. What she does not know yet is that this particular quality, the quality Henry values most in her father, is going to be the thing that gets him killed. Thomas More and Henry VIII were friends. This is the fact that everything else in this chapter has to be read against, because it is easy to tell this story as a confrontation between a tyrant and a martyr. And that telling is not wrong exactly, but it misses the thing that made it genuinely painful. They had known each other for years before the break, with Rome made their friendship into a collision. Henry had visited More at Chelsea with the ease of a man visiting someone he genuinely liked. They walked in the garden and argued about theology and astronomy and the nature of good government. And More pushed back in ways that Henry found stimulating rather than threatening. For a while, More was the author of Utopia, one of the most admired books in Europe. He was a man whom Erasmus counted as an intellectual equal, a figure whose reputation for honesty stretched across the continent. He had served Henry as a diplomat, as a privy councillor, and eventually as Lord Chancellor after Wolsey's fall. Henry called him, more than once, his good friend. More was also a man of Catholic faith, so deep and so precisely considered that it had become architecture. Every beam and joint of his understanding of the world ran through the Church and through the authority of the Pope as the successor of Peter. This was not sentimental attachment. It was the structural, load-bearing element of everything he believed. You could not remove it without bringing everything else down. When Henry began moving toward the break with Rome, More resigned the chancellorship quietly, citing health, and retired to Chelsea. He did not preach against Henry. He did not write pamphlets. He did not organize opposition. He simply withdrew and said nothing. But here is what that silence actually was. Everyone who understood the situation read it correctly. Thomas More's retirement was itself a statement. Everyone knew where he stood on papal authority. A man of his reputation choosing silence was not the same as a man of his reputation choosing agreement. The silence communicated exactly what it was meant to communicate. That More could not endorse what was coming, expressed in the most discreet language available to him. Henry needed something more than silence. He needed, with a need that had become almost physical in its intensity, for the people he respected most to tell him he was right, not merely to comply, not merely to avoid contradicting him openly, to look him in the eye and say, yes, this is correct. This is consonant with God's law and England's honour. He needed it from More, specifically because More was the man whose agreement would mean the most. If Thomas More said the thing was right, then the thing was right. More would not say it. The Act of Supremacy, passed in 1534, every person who held office or authority in England was required to swear an oath acknowledging Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England. The oath was not optional. It was not a matter of private conscience. It was a public sworn declaration that either came out of your mouth or was noticed in its absence. More stood in front of the commissioners who administered the oath and said nothing. He declined to give reasons. He understood English law well enough to know that silence was not legally equivalent to expressed denial. He was trying to find the narrowest possible space between compliance and the betrayal of everything he believed. A space where he might survive without lying. Henry had already closed that space. The law had been written specifically to eliminate it. More was arrested and sent to the Tower in April of 1534. He remained there for over a year. His daughter Margaret visited him and spent the entire period trying to find arguments that might persuade him to simply take the oath and live. Her letters to him are among the most painful documents of the period. The letters of a daughter who loved her father and understood his reasons and could not stop trying anyway. He answered her with a gentleness that did not move. The government eventually decided that continued silence was legally unsustainable and arranged a charge. Richard Rich, the Solicitor General, testified that More had explicitly denied the royal supremacy in a private conversation. More denied it at trial. More was almost certainly telling the truth, and Rich was almost certainly not. It did not matter. The verdict had been decided before the trial began. More was convicted of treason in July of 1535. On the morning of the execution, More climbed the steps to the scaffold on Tower Hill. He was weak from months in the Tower, but his manner, according to the accounts of those present, was composed in a way that struck observers as something beyond ordinary courage. He asked the lieutenant of the Tower to help him up the steps, noting that for his coming down he could shift for himself. He told the crowd he died as the king's good servant, but God's first. Then he knelt, and a man he had never wronged took his head. Henry had executed his friend for the offence of insufficient agreement. The message was received by every person in England who had been watching, and they had all been watching. The line between disagreement and treason had moved. It had been moved to a location where almost any position short of active, vocal, enthusiastic support of the king's decisions could become dangerous, depending on the mood of the court and the ambitions of the people around you. The court that gathered around Henry in the years after More's death was not a court of fools or cowards. It was a court of people who had done the calculation and arrived at the only acceptable answer. You agreed with the king. You agreed loudly, when loudness was required, and quietly, when quiet was sufficient. You found the words that matched what he needed to hear, and you said them clearly, and you kept whatever else you actually thought somewhere behind your face, where it could not be used against you. Catherine of Aragon had refused and was dying slowly in reduced circumstances in the English countryside. Thomas More had refused and was in the ground. Thomas Wolsey had failed and was gone. The lesson was not subtle. And, in the rooms above, 6 floors up from where More had sat, writing letters to his daughter, a woman named Anne Boleyn was adjusting to her new life as Queen of England, trying to give Henry the one thing that More and Wolsey and Catherine had all been unable to provide. She was running out of time to do it. She did not know that yet. Westminster, November of 1534. A clerk is reading aloud in Parliament, and the room is very quiet. The document is not long. Its core statement fits in a single sentence. The King of England is the supreme head of the Church of England, not a servant of the Church, not a protector of the Church. The head, the final authority, the person from whom all ecclesiastical power in England now flows and to whom it all returns. When the reading ends, the men in the room look at each other. They know what they have just done, and they know there is no undoing it. Henry had not invented sacred kingship. European monarchs had been claiming divine sanction for their authority since before Charlemagne, and the argument between kings and popes over who held ultimate power had been running for centuries. Henry was walking into a long argument, not starting a new one, but what he did in England was something more specific and more explosive than anything that had come before it. He made obedience to the king and obedience to the church in England the same thing. He collapsed the distinction between the spiritual and the political inside his own kingdom so completely that from this point forward, to question royal religious policy was not just political dissent. It was heresy, and to refuse the church's new structure was not just theological disagreement. It was treason. Those two words had existed before 1534 in their own separate legal universes, with their own separate courts and their own separate procedures. Henry fused them. In fusing them, he created a zone of authority that no English king had occupied before, and he needed a man capable of making that zone real in the daily lives of people across England, not just in Parliament, not just in the courts, in the parishes, in the monasteries, in the prayer books that ordinary people held in their hands every morning. Thomas Cromwell understood what this required with a clarity that Henry, who thought in terms of outcomes and desired realities, did not always supply for himself. The act of supremacy needed machinery to function. It needed enforcement. It needed a way to move from a statement of principle to a reality that people across England actually lived inside. Cromwell built the machinery. He was in his late 40s by this point. A compact man who had come from nothing by Tudor standards and had made himself indispensable to the most demanding employer in the country. His background was not the church, like Wolsey, and not the old nobility. Like most of the men surrounding Henry, he had been a merchant, a soldier, a lawyer. He had watched Wolsey rise and fall from close range, and had drawn his own conclusions about how to avoid the same end. His method was different from Wolsey's. Wolsey had operated through personal presence, through being the most intelligent person in the room. Cromwell operated through systems. He built procedures, offices, records, and processes that did not depend on any single person's presence to function. He was assembling the administrative skeleton of the modern English state, piece by piece, in service of a king whose will had just been declared the law of God. The treason laws were extended so that speaking against the royal supremacy in any form became a capital offence. A network of informers developed during this period, not a formal intelligence service in the modern sense, but comprehensive enough that people in taverns and private homes found themselves reported for conversations that would have passed unnoticed 5 years earlier. But the most visible demonstration of what the supremacy meant in practice, the one that forced ordinary people to participate in the change rather than simply observe it, was what happened in the churches, in every parish in England, in every monastery and cathedral and chapel. The books used for daily prayer contained references to the Pope, references to the authority of Rome, references to the supremacy of the successor of Peter over the universal church. These were not incidental mentions. They were woven into the prayers said every day, embedded in the language through which ordinary English people had related to God for generations. Cromwell's commissioners travelled through England with a simple instruction. The Pope's name was to be removed from the books, cut out, crossed out, scraped away, across England, tens of thousands of times. Men picked up knives or brushes and removed a name from a page they had read their whole lives. The physical act matters in a way that a policy announcement never could. It was not enough for Henry to declare the world had changed. He needed the hands of ordinary people to make the change real. Every priest who scraped the Pope's name from his prayer book was, in that moment, physically participating in the creation of Henry's new order. He was not simply subject to it. He was an instrument of it. You do not just tell people the world has changed. You make them change it themselves. Then it is their world too. Anne Boleyn was already pregnant when the act passed. She and Henry had married in a private ceremony in January of 1533. In the kind of urgent privacy that suggests the pregnancy may have been a factor in the timing, Thomas Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, annulled the marriage to Catherine in May of 1533. 5 months later, Anne gave birth. The child was healthy. The child was a girl. Henry named her Elizabeth, and did his best not to let the court see how completely the outcome had failed to match the only outcome he had built all of this for. He did not succeed in hiding it. The celebrations planned for the birth of a prince were quietly scaled back. The letters announcing the birth had been prepared with spaces left for the name and sex to be filled in, and those spaces had clearly been designed for a different answer. Anne had given him a daughter. Catherine had given him a daughter. The Reformation of the English Church, the Act of Supremacy, the destruction of Thomas More, 6 years of the great matter, the break with Rome, all of it had produced a daughter. Henry went back to work. He still needed a son, and Thomas Cromwell, who had just built a machine capable of turning the king's will into the law of the land, was already thinking about what else that machine could do. Tower Green. Inside the walls of the Tower of London. The morning of May the 19th, 1536, a woman walks to a small scaffold that has been erected on the grass. She is probably in her mid-30s, though her exact age has always been uncertain. Filtered as most details of her life are through sources with reasons to be unreliable. She is dressed carefully. She has thought about what she is wearing. She has thought about what she is going to say. She makes a brief speech. It avoids any direct accusation of the king. It avoids anything that would make Henry's treatment of her daughter more complicated than it already is. She uses her last public words to protect Elizabeth. Her daughter is 2 years old. Anne knows that the child is still alive, still a princess, still dependent on the goodwill of the man who has just ordered her mother's execution. So Anne Boleyn's final public act is to say nothing that might endanger the girl she is leaving behind. Then she kneels, and the executioner, a specialist brought from Calais because he is skilled with a sword rather than an axe, does his work. It is over, quickly. A few miles away, Henry VIII is playing music. By the following morning he has ridden to meet Jane Seymour. They are betrothed the same day. 11 days after Anne's execution, they are married. Anne Boleyn became Queen of England in the spring of 1533 and was dead by the summer of 1536. 3 years and a few months. Shorter than the time Henry spent writing her letters before she agreed to marry him. Shorter than most of the legal proceedings required to end his first marriage. She spent most of those 3 years pregnant or recovering from pregnancy. Elizabeth in September of 1533, a miscarriage in 1534, a stillborn boy in January of 1536. The same month Catherine of Aragon died. That last loss was the one that mattered most in the calculation Henry was running. The charges brought against Anne in the spring of 1536 were extraordinary. Adultery with 5 men, including her own brother George, plotting with those men to kill the king. Conspiracy against Henry's life, constituting treason at the highest level. The historical consensus among serious scholars of the Tudor period is that these charges were almost certainly fabricated. The evidence was thin in ways that contemporaries themselves noticed. The confessions were obtained under circumstances that made them unreliable. The speed of the proceedings, from arrest to execution in less than 3 weeks, was not the speed of a justice system seeking truth. It was the speed of a system that had been given a destination and was moving toward it as efficiently as possible. Thomas Cromwell coordinated the process. He later acknowledged to the imperial ambassador that he had taken it upon himself to arrange the destruction of Anne and the men accused alongside her. The language he used suggested the frank acknowledgement of a man who believed himself secure enough to be honest about what he had done. He was wrong about being secure. But that comes later. What matters here is what this moment revealed about the machine Henry and Cromwell had built together. Henry was 44 years old. His leg had begun to trouble him, an ulcer on his thigh that would never fully heal. He had broken with Rome, executed his friend Thomas More, dissolved his first marriage, and constructed an entirely new legal and religious architecture for England. He had done all of it, at least in part, in the service of getting the one thing he needed most. And that one thing had not arrived. Anne had given him a daughter and 2 failed pregnancies. Catherine had given him a daughter and multiple failed pregnancies. The pattern was the same across both marriages. And Henry drew the conclusion he drew from most problems in his life, which was that the wrong people were in the wrong positions and needed to be replaced. What Anne understood in the weeks before her arrest is difficult to know with certainty. The sources from her side are limited and filtered through hostile hands. What survives is the record of a woman who was fighting, who was trying to find the combination of appeal and loyalty and argument that would change the direction of what was coming, who was trying, in the specific and limited vocabulary available to a queen whose husband had decided to be done with her, to make him change his mind. He did not change his mind. She was arrested on May 2nd, 1536. She was taken to the Tower of London, the same tower where she had stayed the night before her coronation 3 years earlier. When queens lodged before their official crowning, she reportedly said, on entering, that it was too good for her, and laughed, and then wept. The trials moved with the speed Cromwell had designed them to move. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. She had 10 days between her sentence and the morning on Tower Green. The accounts from people who saw her during those 10 days describe a woman who had moved past the particular kind of fear that attaches to hope, into something more stable, something closer to the stillness that arrives when there is nothing left to fight for and nothing left to lose. Thomas Cranmer, who owed his archbishopric, in large part, to Anne's support, visited her, and afterward wrote to Henry that he had never seen a woman of greater virtue and holiness. He wrote this knowing exactly what Henry's current feelings toward her were. That was either honesty or extraordinary courage, or both. She used her last public breath to protect Elizabeth. Then it was over. The thing Henry learned from Anne's death, the thing that made it different from every other crisis of his reign, was this. He had discovered that a queen could be unmade. A marriage could be dissolved, not through years of legal argument and papal negotiation, but through a process that took 3 weeks from arrest to burial. A woman who wore the crown of England on a Tuesday could be in the ground before the month was out. That knowledge did not make Henry more careful. It made him less. He had proven to himself and to every person watching that the machinery he and Cromwell had built was capable of anything he needed it to do. The court understood this. The court had no choice but to understand it. You agreed with the king. You agreed loudly and completely and without any visible reservation. You kept in mind what had happened to Catherine dying alone in the countryside, and More on the scaffold, and Anne Boleyn, who had been Queen of England and was now in a box under the floor of the Chapel Royal in the Tower. And you smiled, and you bowed, and you told Henry VIII whatever he needed to hear, because the alternative had been demonstrated clearly and repeatedly, and nobody still alive wanted to be the next demonstration. Yorkshire, England. The winter of 1536. A monk at Rewrote Abbey wakes before dawn the way he has woken every morning for the past 20 years. He dresses in the dark. He walks the same stone corridor to the same chapel, and takes the same place in the same choir stall, and begins the same morning prayer that has begun every day at Revaux for 400 years. He does not know yet that this is one of the last mornings it will happen. Revaux had been one of the great Cistercian abbeys of England, built into a valley in the North York moors with an architectural ambition that even the commissioners Cromwell sent to assess it noted with something close to admiration before they began stripping it. The church was larger than most cathedrals. The cloisters were intact after 4 centuries. The library held manuscripts that monks had been copying and preserving since before anyone alive could remember. The surrounding land had been farmed by monastic hands for so long that the terraces cut into the hillsides looked like they had grown there, something that had simply always been part of the landscape. Within months of the commissioner's visit, the lead was stripped from the roof. Then the bells came down. Then the books were dispersed. Then the people walked out. Multiply that by 825. That is roughly the number of monasteries, priories, convents, and friaries dissolved in England and Wales between 1536 and 1541 under the legislation Cromwell designed and Henry authorized. It was the largest transfer of property in England since the Norman conquest, and it happened in 5 years. To understand what this actually meant, you have to understand what the monasteries were in 16th century England. They were the hospitals. In a country with no state medical system and no organized network of secular care, the monasteries were where you went when you needed treatment you could not provide for yourself. They were the schools, because literacy in England was almost entirely a monastic product. The monks taught. They kept the books. They trained the men who staffed the administrative positions of church and state. They were the hostels. Because a traveller in England could expect food and shelter at a monastery at the end of a day's journey, with a reliability that secular inns could not match. They were the safety net, because the monasteries distributed charity. The poorest people in England, those with no land and no family with resources, were in significant numbers dependent on monastic giving for their survival. When Cromwell's commissioners arrived with their inventories and their legal instruments, they were not simply closing religious institutions. They were removing the load-bearing walls from a social structure that had been standing for centuries, and they were doing it without anything prepared to replace what was being removed. The hospitals did not get replaced for generations. The schools contracted sharply before secular alternatives slowly grew. The charity stopped and the people who had depended on it had nowhere to go. The roads of England in the years after the dissolution filled with a new population of displaced people, former monks and the servants who had served them and the poor who had relied on them, moving through a country that had not thought seriously about what to do with them. This is not an argument that the monasteries were perfect. Some were genuine centers of corruption. Some had accumulated wealth that was difficult to square with the Christian teaching about poverty and service that was supposed to govern them. Cromwell's commissioners found real abuses, as well as fabricated ones. But the scale of what was done, and the speed, and the absence of any serious plan for the social functions being eliminated, was not the work of a reforming mind. It was the work of a treasury that needed revenue, and a king who needed to fund wars and courts and building projects, and who had just been handed one of the largest windfalls of land and wealth in English history. Most of the land was sold. Henry sold it rather than keeping it, and the wealth of 4 centuries of monastic accumulation flowed outward into the hands of the Tudor gentry and nobility. Every family that bought dissolved monastic land now had a material reason to prefer that England never return to Rome. If Catholicism came back and the monasteries were restored, the land would have to go back. Cromwell had not just satisfied the immediate needs of the royal treasury, he had made the break with Rome structurally irreversible, embedded it in the property records of England's most powerful families in a way that no future parliament could easily undo. You do not just tell people the world has changed. You give them something to lose if the old world comes back. Cromwell kept records of everything. He ran the dissolution while simultaneously managing foreign policy, overseeing the implementation of the supremacy, supervising the rewriting of English law in dozens of areas, and maintaining the daily business of being the king's chief minister. His correspondence from this period runs to thousands of documents. The paper trail of a government operating at the edge of its capacity, under the direction of a man who slept very little and expected the same from everyone around him. He was building something real. The England he was building was more centralized, more dependent on royal authority, less mediated by independent institutions with their own sources of power and legitimacy. It was, by the standards of the 16th century, a modern state. Whether it was a better England for the people at the bottom, for the displaced monks and the sick who had nowhere to go, and the poor who had lost their source of charity, is a question that the administrative records do not address. Cromwell was thinking about structure. He was thinking about power. He was not thinking about the monk at Revaux walking the stone corridor in the dark for the last time. And somewhere in the middle of all this building, Cromwell made a mistake. It was not a mistake of calculation exactly. It was a mistake of category. He had spent years understanding Henry as a man who needed results, who needed the machinery of government to function, who needed someone capable of turning the chaos of royal desire into the order of implemented policy. He understood that role and filled it with a competence that nobody else in England could match. What he underestimated was the specific nature of the danger he was in. A man who knows where all the bodies are, in both the metaphorical and the occasionally literal sense. A man who has been present for every decision and every compromise and every moment when the king's actions fell short of the image the king had constructed of himself, is a man who accumulates a kind of knowledge that power finds dangerous, not because he would use it against Henry, but simply because he had it. Cromwell had built a machine that could do almost anything. The machine could not protect him from the man who ran it. He would find that out soon enough. But before that, there was Jane Seymour, and the son she carried, and the brief season in which Henry VIII finally got what he had broken everything to have. Hampton Court Palace, October of 1537. Jane Seymour has been in labour for 2 days. Outside the palace, people have been gathering for hours. Along the roads leading from London, messengers stand with fresh horses, ready to ride the moment there is news to carry. In churches across England, prayers have been said for this birth with a consistency and a fervour that reflects something beyond ordinary religious observance. Everyone in England understands what is at stake. Everyone has been waiting for a long time. Inside the palace, Henry VIII waits. He has been here before, in the particular suspended anxiety of waiting for news from a birth chamber. He has been here with Catherine. Multiple times, he has been here with Anne. Each time the news came back wrong, or not wrong exactly, but not right enough. Not the specific rightness that the dynasty required. He has spent the better part of 20 years living inside this particular kind of waiting. On October the 12th, 1537, Jane Seymour delivers a son. The baby is healthy. He is named Edward, after the patron saint of the English monarchy. Bonfires are lit across England. The Te Deum is sung in churches. Cannon fire from the Tower of London. Messengers ride in every direction carrying the news that the thing which had seemed impossible for so long has finally happened. Henry has his son. Jane Seymour was not Anne Boleyn. This was, for Henry, at the moment he married her, the most important thing about her. She was quiet where Anne had been loud. She was deferential where Anne had argued. She was pale and composed and careful in a court that had spent 3 years at high voltage, watching a queen fight for her position with an intensity that had exhausted almost everyone who witnessed it. Henry had pursued her with the directness of a man who had learned from the years with Anne. That extended delay had costs he was no longer willing to pay. When Henry sent Jane a letter and a purse of gold coins as a gesture of romantic interest, Jane's brother Edward returned the coins unopened and coached his sister to tell the king that her honour was the one treasure she possessed that had no price. Henry found this response charming. The Seymour family found it strategically correct. They were betrothed the day after Anne's execution. They were married 11 days after that. Now there is a son in the nursery and bonfires in the streets, and Henry VIII has everything he has broken everything to have. He should be happy. What the accounts from the days following Edward's birth show instead is something harder to categorize. The relief is real and visible. Nobody in the court doubts it. But there are also accounts of a man who had arrived at the destination he had been traveling toward his entire adult life, and found that destinations do not feel the way the traveling does. The traveling had direction and purpose, and the daily clarity of knowing what needed to happen next. The arrival left him in a room with everything he had wanted, and no map for what came after. Jane was ill. The cause of her death, 12 days after Edward's birth, has been debated for centuries. Puerperal fever, the infection that killed so many women in the days after childbirth, before modern medicine, is the most commonly cited explanation. The symptoms recorded by those present are consistent with serious infection. She declined with the speed that infected blood produces in a body already exhausted by a difficult labour. When word reached Henry, he withdrew. He went to a private room and was not seen for several days. He mourned Jane with a consistency he had not shown for any other loss. He wore black for 3 months. He did not entertain the suggestions about remarriage that his council almost immediately began raising. Suggestions that were not callous but entirely practical. Because an heir who was 12 days old was not a secure succession, and everyone in the government understood this. For 2 years, he did not remarry. 2 years. Henry VIII, a man who had never been patient about anything he wanted, who had spent 6 years forcing the legal and religious architecture of England to bend around his desire for Anne Boleyn, waited 2 years before he agreed to discuss another marriage. Why Jane and not Catherine? Catherine had been loyal and dignified and had held her position against him with a moral consistency that commands respect across 5 centuries. Why did Henry mourn Jane more deeply than the woman who had given him everything she had? The answer is probably the cruelest thing in the entire story. He mourned Jane because Jane gave him what he wanted and then died before he had to find out what he was going to need from her next. She was preserved in his memory at the moment of his greatest victory. She never became a problem to be managed. She never failed him. She never stood her ground against him. She gave him Edward and then she was gone. And what remained was a memory that had no complications attached to it. No argument that had gone too far. No disappointment that had hardened into something permanent. She never gave him a reason to be done with her. Henry had Catherine's portrait removed from places of honour. He had Anne's image systematically eliminated from the royal residences. The carved initials, the painted emblems, the woven patterns installed during 3 years of her queenship. Jane's portrait stayed. Jane's memory stayed. Getting what you want does not end the wanting. He had known this abstractly for years, watching himself want and acquire and want again since the first days of his reign. But it had always been possible, before Jane's death, to tell himself that the next acquisition would be the one that finally settled things. The son had always been the end point. Get the son, and the rest resolves itself. The son was in the nursery now, in a household of nurses and physicians whose entire purpose was keeping one small child alive through an infancy that was not guaranteed. Henry visited him and held him and looked at the thing he had broken everything to have, and felt the particular emptiness of a man who had spent so long pursuing something that he forgot to think about what came after getting it. He told his council to begin looking for a new wife. The council, which had been waiting for permission to have this conversation, got to work immediately. None of them knew that what was coming would do more damage to more people than anything Henry had done yet. Richmond Palace, January of 1557. A woman is sitting by a window in the English countryside, reading a letter. She is in her early 40s now, settled into a comfortable life in a way that reflects 16 years of careful management of her own situation. She has properties across England. She has income. She has a relationship with the English court that can only be described by any honest measure as a success. She has outlived 2 of Henry's other wives. She has outlived the men who arranged her humiliation. She has outlived Thomas Cromwell, who organized the entire affair, by 17 years. The letter tells her that Henry VIII's last surviving child, the young Queen Mary, is dying. Anne of Cleves sets the letter down. She feels, by every account that survives from people who knew her in these years, something that is not grief exactly, and not triumph exactly, but something closer to the quiet satisfaction of a woman who made one very good decision at a very dangerous moment and has been living comfortably on the proceeds of it ever since. She will outlive Mary too. She will die later that same year, 1557, the last of Henry's 6 wives to go. Having navigated the most dangerous marriage in European politics and emerged with her head, her property, her income, and apparently her peace of mind entirely intact. She was the smartest person in the entire story of Henry's marriages, and almost nobody gives her credit for it. To understand how she got there, you have to go back to the autumn of 1538, when Thomas Cromwell faced a problem that had nothing to do with law or administration, and everything to do with finding Henry VIII a wife. Henry had been a widower for 2 years. His council needed him to remarry. England needed the succession more secure than a single 9-year-old boy. And Cromwell, who had been managing Henry's political needs for a decade, understood that the right marriage could solve several problems at once. It could bind England to a Protestant alliance at a moment when the Catholic powers of Europe were making unsettling noises about their intentions toward the island that had broken with Rome. The leading candidate was Anne, daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves, a territory in what is now northwestern Germany. Her brother William was a significant Protestant prince with useful connections. The match made diplomatic sense on every level that mattered. Henry asked for a portrait. Cromwell commissioned Hans Holbein, the same painter whose image of Henry had become the visual language of Tudor power, to travel to Cleves and paint Anne. Holbein went. He painted. He returned with a portrait of a woman who appeared pleasant-featured, calm, and reasonably attractive in the measured way of formal portraiture. Holbein was extraordinarily skilled at capturing a kind of composed dignity that translated well onto a painted panel. He painted what was there. What was there in Anne of Cleves was a woman of decent features, strong build, limited French or English, and very little of the courtly polish that Henry, having spent his adult life surrounded by women trained in the French and English traditions of court culture, unconsciously expected in a wife. The portrait showed the first quality clearly. It did not prepare Henry for the absence of the second. The brocade and the careful lighting and the formal posture had done their job. The actual woman who arrived in England that winter was a different experience entirely. The diplomatic arrangements moved forward through 1539. Anne travelled to England in December. Henry, who had a history of spontaneous romantic gestures he considered charming, and that the women involved sometimes experienced differently, decided to ride to Rochester to meet her before the formal reception. He came in disguise, as a cloaked stranger, intending to surprise her with the kind of romantic ambush that worked well in the stories courtiers told about chivalrous kings. He arrived. He was announced. Anne looked at the large, cloaked man who had appeared in her chambers, and responded with the polite attention of a woman who had been told a visitor was coming, and was waiting to understand what the visitor wanted. She did not recognize him. She felt no evident rush of attraction toward this particular stranger. She turned her attention back to the entertainment she had been watching before he arrived. Henry went back to his own chambers and told his attendants she was nothing like her portrait. He used a phrase that followed Anne through history. He called her a Flemish mare. He then married her anyway, because the diplomatic arrangements were already in place, and the political consequences of cancelling were worse than the personal ones of proceeding. The ceremony was on January the 6th, 1540. The marriage was never consummated. Henry told his physicians, so in terms that left no ambiguity about either the fact or his feelings about it. Here is what Anne did next, and why it matters more than anything else in this chapter. She agreed to the annulment without argument. She did not fight. She did not appeal to her brother or to the diplomatic weight of Cleves. She did not make demands that would have made her difficult to manage. She said yes to the dissolution with the equanimity of a woman who had taken one clear look at her situation and understood exactly what her best option was. She negotiated with calm precision. In settlement, she received a comfortable annual income, several properties including Hever Castle, which had been the Boleyn family home, and the honorary title of the king's beloved sister. She retired to the English countryside, learned English, developed what appear to have been genuinely friendly relations with Henry and with his 3 children, and proceeded to outlive everyone involved in the situation by years. She had looked at Henry VIII and made the calculation that no other woman in his life had been positioned to make quite so cleanly. She had decided that what was on offer was not worth the price of the alternative. And then she had gotten out. Thomas Cromwell did not get out. Picture him, in the weeks after the annulment was finalized, working late in his offices at court, the candles burning down around him, the correspondence stacked in its usual organized towers on every surface. He is still running the English government. He is still the most capable administrator in the kingdom. He understands every mechanism of power in England in 1540, every leverage point, every pressure that can be applied and released, every way that legal instruments can be turned toward desired outcomes. He had received the earldom of Essex in April, the highest honour Henry had ever given him. He had accepted it with the appropriate gratitude, the appropriate words, the appropriate performance of a man who understood that visible gratitude was part of the job. But here is what Cromwell, for all his extraordinary intelligence, could not bring himself to do in those weeks. He did not make plans to leave England. He did not move assets. He did not reach out quietly to allies who might protect him if the wind shifted. He did not do any of the things that a man who genuinely believed himself in danger would do. There is only one explanation that fits the evidence. Cromwell could not take those steps because taking them would mean acknowledging to himself, if to nobody else, that Henry no longer trusted him the way he once had. And Cromwell, who had built his entire identity on being the one man Henry truly trusted, who had organized his life and his work and his sense of himself around that particular relationship, could not face that acknowledgement. He knew every mechanism of the machine he had built. He could not use any of them to save himself, because saving himself would mean admitting that the machine might now be pointed at him, and that was the one thing he was not capable of believing. The machine did not need his belief to function. The Howard family had been waiting for an opening. The Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, was everything Cromwell was not by birth. Ancient nobility, Catholic in sympathy, deeply invested in a vision of England where men of his lineage occupied the positions that Cromwell, a butcher's grandson, had spent a decade accumulating. Norfolk had been waiting for years for the moment when Cromwell's usefulness to Henry would be outweighed by his dangerousness to Henry. The Cleves marriage had given Norfolk the opening, not because it destroyed Cromwell's value overnight, but because it planted a seed of doubt and gave Henry's resentment somewhere to grow. And Norfolk had a niece. Her name was Catherine Howard. In June of 1540, Cromwell was arrested at the council table. The charges were treason and heresy, constructed using the same legal architecture he had built to charge others. He was taken to the Tower with the efficiency of a process he himself had helped design. He wrote to Henry from his cell. The letter was long and desperate. The letter of a man who had built his entire career on understanding how power operated and could not quite believe that the rules he had always lived by had been suspended without notice. He called Henry "Most Gracious Prince." He said he had been slandered by traitors. He asked for mercy. He used the word 3 times in a single passage. Mercy, mercy, mercy. Henry signed the attainder. Cromwell was executed on Tower Hill on July the 28th, 1540. The execution was, by most accounts, badly done. The headsman was inexperienced, and it took more than one blow. Cromwell, who had arranged so many smooth proceedings for other people, died in a manner that was neither quick nor clean. Henry later told his council that he had been misled into executing the most faithful servant he ever had. He expressed this with what appears to have been genuine feeling. He expressed it while Catherine Howard was already his wife. While the Howard family was already moving into the positions Cromwell's removal had freed up, while the England that Cromwell had built continued functioning on the administrative foundations he had laid. The regret was real. It was also useless. The machine kept running without its builder. That was, in its way, the final proof of how well Cromwell had built it. Hampton Court Palace, 1540. The king is in love again. He calls her his rose without a thorn. He showers her with gifts, with land and jewels and the extravagant attention of a man who has decided, at 49 years old, that he has finally found what the previous 5 marriages had all been searching for. He attends religious services more regularly. He tells people around him that God has sent him a jewel of womanhood after the troubles he has endured. The troubles he has endured. Catherine of Aragon, who held her position against him for decades. Anne Boleyn, who was executed on charges most serious historians now regard as fabricated. He describes these women as his troubles. And Catherine Howard, a teenager with no political protection beyond her family's ambition, as his gift from God. She is probably in her late teens when Henry marries her, though her exact age has never been established with certainty. The records from her early life are incomplete in the way that records from lives not considered important enough to document carefully tend to be incomplete. What is known is that she was young, that she came from the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where supervision was not close, and that she had formed attachments there, with a music teacher named Henry Manox, and later with a young gentleman named Francis Dereham, that her family had not investigated before placing her in the path of the king. The Howard family had noticed Henry noticing her, and the Howard family had made arrangements accordingly. Henry was 49. His leg was in near constant pain. The ulcer that had begun years earlier had spread and worsened in ways that 16th century medicine could slow but not resolve. He was carried between rooms in a chair. The body that had once moved through a room with the easy authority of someone who had never doubted his physical superiority was now a daily source of suffering. The gap between the man in the Holbein portrait and the man that actual people encountered in actual rooms in 1540 was no longer something that could be managed with good lighting and careful ceremony. It was visible. It was present in every interaction. It was the thing that everyone at court saw and nobody was permitted to acknowledge. And here was Catherine Howard, young, attentive, trained by her family to be exactly what Henry needed to see. Henry fell for it completely, and in falling for it, revealed the thing he would have found most intolerable to have identified out loud. He did not need Catherine to be a person with her own interior life, and her own desires, and her own experience of the situation she had been placed in. He needed her to be a reflection. He needed to look at her, looking at him, and see, in the quality of her attention, confirmation that the man in the Holbein portrait was still real, that the golden prince who had dazzled the field of the cloth of gold 30 years earlier had not been replaced entirely by the man who had to be lifted upstairs. He was not thinking about Catherine. He was thinking about himself. The mechanism of Catherine's destruction began in the autumn of 1541, when a man named John Lascelles, whose sister had served in the Dowager Duchess's household at the same time as Catherine, brought information about Catherine's earlier relationships to Archbishop Cranmer. Cranmer understood immediately what he was holding, and also what delivering it would cost. He wrote Henry a letter rather than telling him in person, a choice that reflected careful thought about how Henry received unwelcome information face to face. He passed the letter to Henry before a church service and let him read it alone. Henry's initial response was disbelief. He told his council the charges must be false. He ordered an investigation expecting it to prove him right. It did not prove him right. What the investigation produced, extracted from witnesses under interrogation methods that did not always distinguish carefully between what people remembered and what they said under sufficient pressure, was a picture of Catherine's earlier life that was incompatible with the image Henry had assigned to her. Dereham confessed to the earlier relationship. Under further questioning, he named a courtier named Thomas Culpeper as someone who had met with Catherine privately after her marriage to Henry. Whether Catherine and Culpeper had a physical relationship is genuinely uncertain. The evidence came from interrogations conducted under circumstances where confessing was sometimes less dangerous than denying. What the evidence showed clearly was that Catherine had met with Culpeper in private, late at night, with her lady-in-waiting Jane Boleyn serving as intermediary. It was enough. Henry's reaction when the full picture was presented was not immediate rage. It was something the witnesses described with the careful language people use when a powerful man breaks down. He wept. He asked for a sword to kill Catherine himself. He blamed his council for not protecting him. He told people around him that he had never had good luck with women. He had never had good luck with women. There is an account, recorded by a member of the Spanish ambassador's staff, that Catherine broke free from the people restraining her at Hampton Court and ran down a gallery screaming for Henry, trying to reach him before she was stopped. Henry was in the chapel. He did not come out. Whether the account is precisely accurate is uncertain. The detail of the corridor, the screaming, Henry in the chapel not emerging, carries the weight of something that people needed to record because the emotional logic of it was too precise to leave unwritten. A teenage girl running toward the man whose favor was the only thing standing between her and execution, and the king staying in his chapel, staying very still, staying exactly where he was. Henry signed the Bill of Attainder in February of 1542. On the night before her execution, Catherine Howard asked for the execution block to be brought to her room. She wanted to practice. She wanted to know how to position herself so that she died cleanly and with whatever dignity the situation allowed. She was probably 18 or 19 years old. She had been Queen of England for less than 2 years. She placed her head on the block the following morning on Tower Green, in the same location where Anne Boleyn had died 6 years earlier. And the executioner did his work. Jane Boleyn, who had served as the intermediary between Catherine and Culpeper, and who had testified against Anne Boleyn at her trial 6 years before, was executed on the same morning. She had, by accounts from the period, lost her mental stability during her imprisonment. Parliament had to pass a special act making it legal to execute someone who was mentally incapacitated in order to proceed with her case. Henry was 50 years old. He had been married 5 times. He had executed 2 of his wives. He had watched everyone who came close enough to see him clearly either die or learn to say nothing that might be used against them. The court that surrounded him was not a court of honest people. It was a court of people who had watched what happened to honest people and had drawn the only reasonable conclusion available to them. Henry sat at the center of it, in a body that hurt every day, in rooms that had grown very quiet, looking for a 6th wife. Greenwich Palace, the summer of 1543. A woman is standing at a window, looking out at the river, and she is trying to decide whether to run. Her name is Catherine Parr. She is 31 years old, twice widowed, educated in ways that reflect the new humanist tradition, reshaping English intellectual life. And she is facing a decision that no amount of intelligence or preparation has made easy. Henry VIII has made his interest in her known, not as a question, as a statement of intent, and Catherine Parr, who has been reading the signs of this court long enough to understand exactly what that means, is standing at a window, thinking about the man she actually wants to marry. His name is Thomas Seymour. He is Jane's younger brother, closer to her own age, considerably more appealing by any conventional measure, and the path to him has just been closed by the most powerful statement of intent in England. You do not decline the King of England's attention when it is offered in the way Henry offers things. Catherine accepted the situation with the clarity of a woman who had assessed her options accurately and chosen the one most likely to keep her alive. She married Henry in July of 1543, And from the moment she walked into that marriage, she was running a calculation more precise and more demanding than anything she had been asked to do before. The court she stepped into was not the court of the Golden Prince who had dazzled Europe 30 years earlier. It was a court organized around the management of a sick, suspicious, aging man whose moods shifted with a speed that kept everyone around him in a state of permanent, careful attention. Henry's leg was in near constant pain. The ulcer had spread and worsened. He was carried between rooms in a chair. He was lifted mechanically when stairs were unavoidable. The body that had once filled the Holbein portrait with the easy authority of a man who had never doubted anything about himself was now a daily source of suffering and the particular rage that comes from a proud man being made dependent. Pain changes people. It narrows the distance between manageable frustration and explosive response. The courtiers who had been navigating Henry's temperament for years understood this and factored it into every interaction. You watched his face before you spoke. You read the quality of his silence before deciding whether to continue. You held your actual opinion slightly behind your visible one at all times, ready to adjust if the signals changed. Catherine Parr lived inside this environment and found a way to make it work. She became, genuinely and not merely as performance, a companion to Henry in the way that a person with her combination of warmth and intelligence could become a companion to a man who was running out of people willing to be honest with him. She read with him. She talked theology with him, carefully, in a way that engaged his mind without triggering his defensiveness about his own positions. She managed the relationship between Henry and his 3 children, bringing Mary and Elizabeth back to court after years of complicated absence and creating a dynamic in the royal family that had not existed since the very early years of the reign. She was good at this, genuinely good, in the way of someone who had thought seriously about what the situation required and found that what it required was also something she could actually offer. But in the spring of 1546, the machinery almost took her. The specific theology of the English Reformation was still not settled in 1546. Henry had broken with Rome, but had not become a Protestant in any clear doctrinal sense. He retained much of Catholic practice and Catholic theology within the framework of his national church. The conservatives at court, led by Stephen Gardiner, the Bishop of Winchester, had been watching the reformist influence around Henry with the focused attention of men who understood that the doctrinal direction of the English Church was still in play and that the Queen's sympathies were not on their side. Catherine Parr had reformist sympathies. She expressed them in conversations with Henry. On at least one occasion, the conversation became spirited enough that observers noticed, and Gardiner noticed, and Gardiner saw an opening. A warrant was prepared for Catherine's arrest on the charge of heresy. Someone told her. The sources disagree about who, and the disagreement is probably irresolvable. What is certain is that Catherine found out the warrant existed, and she had somewhere between hours and a day or two to respond before it was executed. She went to Henry. What she said in that conversation is recorded in a later account by a writer with reasons to present Catherine favourably. So, the specifics require some caution. But the substance of what she apparently said is consistent with everything known about her character and her understanding of the man she was talking to. She told him she had only ever argued with him about religion to learn from him, that his knowledge of Scripture was so far beyond hers that the only benefit she could hope to draw from their discussions was the improvement of her own understanding through contact with his superior mind. That if she had ever seemed to contradict him, it was the error of a woman who thought she was asking questions when she was actually overstepping her place. She gave him back the version of himself that he needed to believe in. Henry softened. He told her she was a good woman. He called her sweetheart. The arrest warrant ceased to be relevant. The following day, Gardiner's officers arrived at the palace to execute the arrest. Henry intercepted them in a garden and berated them with a fury that left no doubt about the current state of royal favour regarding the Queen. The arrest did not proceed. Catherine returned to her rooms. She did not, in any record that survives, say what she actually thought about any of it. This is what survival looked like in the court of Henry VIII in 1546. It required you to be genuinely intelligent and then to perform the subordination of that intelligence in front of the one person whose opinion of your intelligence was a matter of life and death. It required you to understand exactly what was happening to you and to respond to it in language that made the person doing it to you feel like your protector. Catherine Parr understood this and did it, and lived. Henry's health continued to decline through the second half of 1546. He was conducting business from a bed or a chair. The circle of people with direct access to him was shrinking as the conservative faction and the reformist faction each maneuvered for position in the transition that everyone could see coming, but that no one could speak about directly. Because speculating about the king's death was itself a treasonable offence. The court was performing normalcy with the focused attention of people who understood that the performance had to hold until it was officially over. Catherine sat with Henry in the evenings. She read with him. She talked with him and was, by every account that survives, present with him in the way that the people who had known him longest were finding it increasingly difficult to be. He was not an easy man to be present with. He was in pain. He was afraid in the way that men who have spent their lives believing themselves exempt from ordinary limitations become afraid when those limitations finally arrive and will not be argued with. He talked about his mortality. He talked about Edward and about the kind of England he wanted to leave the boy. He was, in these conversations, more honest than he had probably been with anyone since Thomas More. And More had been dead for 11 years. Catherine listened. She said the things that were helpful and did not say the things that were dangerous, and managed the distinction between those two categories with a precision that reflected everything she had learned about surviving in a world Henry had made. On the night of January the 27th, 1547, it was clear to everyone sitting with him that the end was very close. Archbishop Cranmer was summoned. Cranmer arrived and took Henry's hand and asked him to give a sign of faith, to squeeze if he trusted in the mercy of God. Henry squeezed his hand. He died in the early hours of January the 28th, 1547. He was 55 years old. Catherine Parr was a widow for the third time. She married Thomas Seymour 4 months later, with a speed that reflected the fact that the long calculation she had been running had always included this particular outcome at the end. She had been patient. She had been careful. She had outlasted the man who had made patience a survival skill rather than a virtue. She died the following year, in 1548, of complications after the birth of her daughter by Thomas Seymour. She was 36 years old. She had outlasted Henry VIII by less than 2 years. But she had outlasted him in the world he had built, where outlasting was the measure of everything. That was not nothing. That was everything. On the morning of January the 28th, 1547, 3 people woke up to a world that had just changed completely. They were Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth Tudor. Between them, they were about to spend the next 45 years living out the full consequences of everything their father had done. Henry had spent 43 years building toward a single outcome. He had broken a church and dissolved monasteries and executed queens and destroyed advisors and remade the legal architecture of a nation. And the specific reason behind all of it the one he could never state in a way that fully satisfied even himself, was the boy in the nursery, the male heir, the proof that the dynasty would continue, that the old wars would not come back, that the thing he had been given and had spent his life protecting would not end with him. The boy was 9 years old when Henry died. Edward VI became King of England on January the 28th, 1547. His uncle Edward Seymour, Jane's brother, moved within days to establish himself as Lord Protector, the regent who would govern England in the name of the child king. The manoeuvring that had been running under the surface of Henry's final months surfaced immediately, and with the speed of water released from a dam. The boy king was intelligent. Those who knew him described someone with his grandfather Henry VII's precision and his father's quick mind, a child who engaged seriously with ideas, and who had been educated by some of the finest Protestant scholars available. Under Edward, and the men who governed in his name, the English Reformation moved faster and further than it had under Henry. The careful theological ambiguity that Henry had maintained for years was abandoned for a clearer Protestant direction. Edward was sick by his mid-teens, with what was most likely tuberculosis. He declined through 1552 and into 1553 with the speed that disease produces in a young body with insufficient defences. He was 15 years old, and he knew he was dying. And in knowing it, he did something that revealed exactly whose son he was. He tried to control the future with a document. Edward wrote a device for the succession that attempted to pass the crown to Lady Jane Grey, the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Mary, bypassing both his sisters. He was a dying teenager trying to prevent a Catholic succession with the same legal instrument his father had used to rearrange reality throughout his entire reign. He had watched his father do it. He believed it worked. It worked for 9 days. Jane Grey was proclaimed queen when Edward died in July of 1553. 9 days later, Mary Tudor entered London with enough popular support to make clear that the device had not accomplished what Edward intended. Jane was imprisoned. Mary was queen. Henry had worried about female succession his entire adult life. He had broken a church to avoid it. He now had it. His eldest daughter, the child of Catherine of Aragon, the woman he had spent 6 years and an entire reformation trying to remove from his life, sat on the throne of England. Mary I was 37 when she became queen. She had spent most of her adult life in intermittent humiliation and genuine suffering. She had watched her mother be set aside and die in reduced circumstances. She had been declared illegitimate herself. She had survived the reigns of her father and her brother by being useful enough to keep and manageable enough to handle carefully. Through all of it, she had maintained a Catholic faith so deeply held that it had survived everything Henry had built to extinguish it. She reversed the Reformation as far as she could reverse it. She restored the Mass. She reconciled England with Rome. She burned approximately 280 people for heresy in less than 4 years, a number that earned her the name Bloody Mary and that remained attached to her reputation for centuries after her death. The burnings were not random cruelty. They were the policy of a woman who believed, with the same complete sincerity that Thomas More had believed in his own position, that heresy was a genuine danger to the souls of her people. She was her mother's daughter in the quality of her conviction. She was her father's daughter in her willingness to use state power to enforce it. She died in 1558 without a child. The Catholic succession she had worked to create collapsed with her. Elizabeth was 25 when she became queen. She had survived everything. She had survived being declared illegitimate by her father. She had survived her mother's execution. She had survived her brother's Protestant reign and her sister's Catholic one. She had survived imprisonment in the Tower on suspicion of involvement in a Protestant rebellion. She had watched the Tudor court consume person after person, and she had learned from watching every single one of them. She knew what happened to women who depended on a king's continued favour. She had watched it happen to her mother. She knew what happened to people who held positions against power without the resources to maintain them. She had watched it happen to Thomas More. She knew what happened to people who became too useful for too long. She had watched it happen to Cromwell. She took the throne and held it for 45 years and never married. Her council spent most of those 45 years trying to persuade her to marry. They presented candidates. They outlined the necessity of a successor. They pointed out, with a persistence she endured with extraordinary patience, that the stability of England required an heir. She told them she was married to England. She never told them the real reason. She did not need to. Anyone who had been paying attention to the preceding 60 years already understood it. She had watched 6 women move through the position she now occupied and exit it through death or humiliation or the quiet erasure that left a person still technically alive but stripped of everything that made the position worth holding. She had been the daughter of the most spectacular exit of all, a woman whose queenship lasted 3 years and whose grave was under the floor of a chapel in the Tower of London. She was not going to be that. She was going to be the thing her father had spent his entire life trying to produce without ever understanding what he was actually building. A Tudor monarch whose authority rested not on the question of succession, but on the daily visible management of a kingdom that had been through more than any kingdom should have to survive in a single generation. Henry spent his life trying to determine how history would remember him. He built walls around his legacy, the way he built walls around his palaces, with the absolute conviction that sufficient will and sufficient power could determine any outcome. He could not determine this one. His daughter determined it for him. The man who had broken a church and executed queens and dissolved monasteries and remade England's legal architecture, who had done all of it to secure a male succession, left a legacy defined by the daughter. He had once signed a document declaring illegitimate. Anne Boleyn's daughter was the greatest Tudor monarch. That was the answer to the question the Holbein portrait had been asking from the very beginning. What happens when a man with that much power runs into the one thing he cannot rewrite? It rewrites him. Walk into almost any gift shop attached to a historic English site and you will find him. On coffee mugs, on refrigerator magnets, on tea towels and tote bags and postcards and the kind of small decorative plates that people buy as jokes and then keep on their shelves for 20 years because they are not quite sure what else to do with them. The image is always the same. 2 feet planted wide, 2 fists on 2 hips, a chest that fills the frame, eyes that do not ask permission. Henry VIII, the most recognizable face in English royal history, the king who is everywhere. He would have loved the ubiquity and hated everything else about it. The original mural that Holbein painted on the wall of Whitehall Palace in 1537 burned in a fire in 1698, along with most of the palace itself. What survived was a preparatory drawing on paper that Holbein made before transferring the design to the wall, and a collection of copies painted by other artists in the decades before the fire. Each one filtered through another set of eyes and another set of assumptions about what the image meant and what it was for. Nobody alive today has seen the original. The Henry VIII that the world recognizes is a copy of a copy, mediated by hands other than Holbein's, preserved through accidents of survival that had nothing to do with Henry's intentions and everything to do with chance. Henry would have found that intolerable. He spent his life arranging the conditions under which he would be remembered. He needed it to be on his terms. He needed the story to be his story. He needed the image to communicate not just power, but the specific meaning of that power, the legitimacy, the dynasty, the divine sanction, the succession settled, and the church ordered, and the history of England running through him and continuing to run through him in the form of the sons he had secured. A painted image is a claim. It is not a proof. And Henry VIII, who spent 43 years demanding that the world treat his claims as proofs, ran into the same wall that every person who has ever tried to use power to substitute for truth eventually runs into. The wall does not care how much power you have. Consider what the portrait was painted in the year of 1537, the year Jane Seymour gave Henry the son he had broken everything to have. The year Jane Seymour died, 12 days after delivering that son. The year Henry had achieved the goal that had driven him for 2 decades, and discovered that achieving it had not produced what he expected achieving it to produce. Holbein painted the most assertive image of royal power in English history in the year that Henry VIII was, privately, a man who had gotten what he wanted and lost what he had not known, he valued. A man sitting in a quiet palace with an infant son in a distant nursery and a body that was beginning to tell him truths he did not want to hear. The gap between the man in the portrait and the man in the palace in 1537 is the gap that the whole story lives inside. He pressed his name into the legal architecture of England the way Nebuchadnezzar pressed his name into bricks, with the conviction that sufficient repetition in sufficiently durable materials would produce the permanence he was looking for. He issued proclamations and signed attainders, and commissioned portraits, and passed acts of parliament, and built a church, with himself at the head of it, and rewrote his children's legal status whenever the current version stopped, serving his purposes. He did everything available to a man of his power and his era to ensure that the story of England would be his story, told in his terms, with the conclusions he had decided on. The story England tells about him is not that story. It is a story about 6 wives, which he would have considered a catastrophic reduction of everything he accomplished. It is a story about a man who got fat and killed people, which would have enraged him. It is a story told on coffee mugs and in television dramas and in the kind of popular history that focuses on the personal at the expense of the constitutional, which is precisely the inversion of the emphasis he would have chosen. He is remembered. He is among the most remembered figures in the history of the English-speaking world. 5 centuries of recognition is not nothing, but recognition is not the same as control. By the final years of his reign, Henry's image had become part of the visual language of royal authority itself, copied and displayed wherever power needed a face. For a while the face was everywhere it needed to be. Then he died, and Edward became king, and Edward's face replaced his in the places where faces were required. Then Mary, then Elizabeth. The portraits of Henry came down from some walls and stayed on others, moved around as the politics of each subsequent reign required different things from the past. Nobody asked Henry which walls he wanted to stay on. That decision, like most of the decisions that determined how history actually remembers people, was made by the people who came after him, on the basis of what they needed rather than what he had intended. Today his face is on a coffee mug in a gift shop near the Tower of London, a few hundred yards from the chapel where Anne Boleyn is buried under the floor, a few hundred yards from the room where Thomas More spent his last year writing letters to his daughter, a few hundred yards from the green where Catherine Howard practiced placing her head on a block so she would die with whatever grace was available to her. The people who buy the mug are not thinking about any of that. They recognize the face. They find it funny or impressive or iconic in the way that objects become iconic, which is to say, it has been reproduced so many times that the reproduction has become the thing rather than the original. They buy it or they do not buy it, and they move on. Henry VIII wanted to be the most powerful figure in the room, in the gift shop, in the dramas, in the popular imagination of the English-speaking world. He is the most present figure. He is everywhere. He is on a mug. He wanted authority. He got attention. He wanted permanence. He got reproduction. He wanted to write the story. The story wrote him. The portrait hangs where it hangs, in whatever form survives, in whatever institution decided it was worth preserving. The man who commissioned it to communicate his power is 5 centuries gone. The power he communicated has long since passed to people who never asked his permission and do not require it. The face remains. Now here is what else remains. Catherine of Aragon held her position to the end. She was the only person in Henry VIII's entire adult life who held a position against him consistently, publicly, and to the end. And she did it not because she was reckless, but because she understood that the position was true, and that nothing Henry could do to her would make it less true. Thomas More died, rather than say a single word he did not believe. He understood English law better than almost anyone, and he used that understanding to find the narrowest possible space between compliance and betrayal. And when Henry closed that space, More accepted the consequence without flinching. Anne Boleyn used her last public breath to protect her daughter. She had 10 days between her sentence and the scaffold, and she used those 10 days to make sure that the 2-year-old girl she was leaving behind would have the best possible chance of surviving in the world her father had built. Thomas Cromwell built something that outlasted him by centuries. The administrative skeleton of the modern English state, the centralized machinery of governance that every English monarch after Henry inherited and built upon, was assembled by a butcher's grandson who was executed by the king he had served. Jane Seymour gave Henry what he wanted and was gone before he could need anything more from her. She was preserved in his memory at the moment of his greatest victory, and that preservation was the only kind of safety available to a woman in her position. Catherine Howard practiced dying with dignity in a room by herself the night before she had to do it for real. She was probably 18 or 19 years old. She had been Queen of England for less than 2 years. She asked for the execution block so she could learn how to place her head correctly. That is what courage looked like for someone who had no other options left. Catherine Parr outlasted everyone by understanding precisely what survival required and paying that price without complaint. She was genuinely intelligent, and she performed the subordination of that intelligence every day in front of the one person whose opinion of her intelligence was a matter of life and death. She outlasted Henry VIII by less than 2 years. In the world he had built, that was everything. 7 people who moved through the orbit of one man's will and left marks on the world that his will could not erase. The face on the mug belongs to him. The story belongs to all of them. That was always going to be the best he could do. He just never knew it.